And now we come to our second panel discussion for today. Diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. Women are believed to be structured differently, biologically and psychologically. But what aggravates this difference is the inferior societal mental makeup, the stereotypes and systemic discrimination meted out to women since our childhood. This perpetuates and endures structural inequalities based solely on a socio-cultural construct, gender. It's imperative for us to realize how catastrophic this can be for us and our society, as curbing the freedom of an entire section of the population will not only infringe their dignity and fundamental freedoms, but will also hold back our socio-political and economic progress. Furthermore, when we talk about diversity, it also includes being supportive and sensitive to the needs of others, regardless of their ethnicity, cultural background, sexuality, and disability. Then comes equity, which simply extends the practice of impartiality to everyone. Finally, inclusion, which ensures that people at every level feel respected and comfortable to speak up and share their ideas. Thankfully, diversity, equity, and inclusion have rightfully risen to the top of organizational priorities. Many organizations recognize that focusing on DE&I is not only the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. And to talk more about this topic, I would like to invite our moderator for today's panel, Lakshmi Muralidharan. Now, Lakshmi has over 18 years of experience in recruitment process, outsourcing, and talent acquisition solutions. And she's currently the Director of Client Solutions APAC at CLO Talent. Lakshmi is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion and front ends DE&I initiatives through her organization. She's an active member of ENG Women's Leaders Group. Lakshmi also recently co-authored the Amazon #1 bestseller book, Shaken Stirred, but Not Deterred. For those of you who would like to find out more about her, do connect with her. Her details are being shared on the chat now. And with that, over to you, Lakshmi.
Thanks for the introduction, Neera. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. I'm really excited to see what our four panelists have today to talk about DE&I. And I think after the session of talking about subconscious biases, it really has some thought-provoking ideas that we've already initiated in our minds here. So I think the session that I'm going to take up is, when we think of the word diversity, equity, and inclusion, the first thing that more than often comes up to our mind is gender. And I do think that we have quite a couple of women here and a few men too who are here today on this webinar. So it would be good to hear what their feedback is. But I think what I'd like to cover today in today's webinar is understand what our four panelists and what have their personal struggles been in this area of being a woman in the workforce, and how have they resolved their issues, and what have their long-term outcomes been. And some of them, of course, have also implemented, DEI initiatives in their organization. What are the pushbacks that they've had? What are the strategies that they've put into place? I think this will be really useful for the audience that we have today, and it will be good to know their successes and their failures that they've had. So I'm going to introduce you to our four panelists today. Today we have Christina Themmer. Christina has over 2 decades of expertise in cross-cultural environments. Christina has been very passionate and has an ambition for learning and developed and paved her way to find next chapters, a social purpose business that seeks to reduce social inequality through coaching and facilitation. Specializing in career development, Christina brings to light the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging of women, enabling them to activate their empowerment and write the next professional chapter of their life This is what she has on her biograph, but I'm going to take 2 minutes and ask Christina to introduce what's not written in here and say a few words about herself.
Thank you very much for having me on the program today, Lakshmi, and I'd like to thank the My Voice and Global Influencers team as well, and like to offer a warm welcome to the other panelists as well. I think that, like, for me, in terms of what isn't written, and that is a great introduction as well, let's just say, I think that really, like, for me, what brings me to this space is the emphasis and what is not written down on LinkedIn or in the My Voice book that I've been part of, just really working with people to help them move the needle. And I think that that is something really experiential. And because of my work in education, training, facilitation, and coaching, it's really about the people that I meet and the support that I can offer, and, you know, in view of creating change. And I think that that's can be a bit hard to capture. Through that work, I've been able to, you know, work with a variety of people of different backgrounds, nationalities, faiths, beliefs. And to me, that's really been an eye-opener in terms of, you know, the difference that we have in our world. And I think that that is a really beautiful aspect of my job. And so with that, you know, there are things that I've learned in terms of lessons to sharpen myself as an individual, both professionally and personally, and lessons that I really take from those experiences and continue sharing forward with people that I work with and meet every day.
Thanks, Christina. Next, I'd like to introduce Rasida Padi. Rasida describes herself as a mom, millennial, and a marketeer in equal parts. Coming from a working class family, Rasida is a firm believer in power of education as a social leveler. She's never believed that coming from an ethnic minority or being a woman or a mother should stop her from pursuing a path to success and claiming a social narrative that empowers the community she represents. Professionally, Rasida is an enterprise technology marketing manager with a background of strategic communications and content marketing. She's a proud mother of 2 girls and considers herself as a feminist. Outside of work, Rasida is passionate about the causes to support female representation in the digital economy and spends her time volunteering for organizations whose missions align with this ideal. Apart from this, Rasida, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you for the introduction. And also thank you to all the panelists for this opportunity to be alongside you on this panel. So Lakshmi, you introduced me as a mom, a millennial, a marketer. The other 2 things about myself that, you know, I don't really kind of write about, because I have a complexity with this identity of mine, is I also identify myself as a Malay Muslim woman. Now, you know, Malay being my ethnicity and Muslim being my faith. Now, the one thing that I often get, you know, when I do go out and people ask me, hey, Rashida, tell me more about yourself and where do you come from? And I say, yes, I identify myself as a Muslim. The other question that typically follows will be, oh, so where do you grow up in? Do you grow up in Malaysia? And, you know, I have to explain like, okay, no, I'm born in Singapore. You know, people get curious about my accent. And then the other thing, you know, about being a Muslim woman and not wearing a hijab is, so you don't wear a hijab. And why is that? And I would say, you know, in the course of our discussion today, I would like kind of just bring this dimension in about, you know, kind of intersectionality and, you know, understanding that we're all unique individuals. And while it is great to see, you know, a collective of, you know, strong, empowered women on this panel, one of the other dimensions, you know, aspect we should be talking about, which I think was addressed in the previous panel as well as I was tuning in, is this acknowledgement that each of us bring different experiences to this world, right? Because we grew up differently, we come from different places, we've been influenced by different worldviews. So I would like kind of, you know, kind of double down on that in the discussion today and share more. Thank you, Lakshmi.
Thanks for that. I'd like to next invite Ruchira Raj. Ruchira Raj works to decode, unblock, enable, and maximize people, businesses, and the social purpose organization. She's an autodidact problem solver with unique perspective, powered by 20 years of diverse big corporate experience across industries like FMCG, consulting, and banking. Ruchira learned her first lessons in equity and diversity and inclusion, growing up in a multicultural India. And in the past 13 years, she's been in Singapore and further built on the same. She studied at IIM Bangalore and social sector leadership from ILSS India. She's also a certified SF coach practitioner and continues her learning and journey by pursuing a master's degree in counseling. When not coaching or consulting or working as a board advisor with social purpose organizations, Ruchita loves to hike and she's in the right place. She loves to hike in the lush trails of Singapore and recently her Krav Maga enthusiast. An interest she shares with her teenage daughter. So over to you, Ruchira, to give a few points about yourself, what I've not already mentioned.
Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you to MBFG for having me on the panel. I'm very happy to be here today. I want to share here that, to add to what Lakshmi's already said, that at the end of the day, I am a South Asian woman in her 40s, hustling like each one of you every day to keep the household running while retaining my own identity as a person. So that's where I think I connect with everyone who's on this panel. I think most people on this panel, as you know, being this individual who's trying to make things work, I identify very closely with DE&I. And like you mentioned, Lakshmi, I've grown up in India. It was a very, very diverse culture. And it was just taken for granted because we had so many different languages, so many foods, so many, festivals all around us. We just grew up like that. And at that time, it was just taken for granted. But when diversity really hit me in a very, very cold way was when I was studying. I did my undergrad in biology. And that's where, the power of diversity came from Mr. Darwin, where we realized that, no diversity means no survival. So I learned about diversity in a very, very cold, hard way. And I was amazed to see how it applies so much in the real world, in the corporate world. And happy to share some of what I've learned and learn from the rest of the panelists and from the members who are joining in. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Thanks for that. And last but not the least, I'd like to introduce Genwa Hapal. Genwa was born and raised in Lebanon. She's well-rounded global HR talent leader with over 15 years of experience. And she focusing on strategizing, design, leading, and delivering large-scale operational talent initiatives. Genwa is first a human, then a leadership coach, and then an epigrammatistic and a strategist thinker, and a futurist as well as strategic HR professional with experience across various industries and countries. Pardon me for a whole lot of words there. She is a passionate and strong advocate of diversity, equity, and inclusion, with an equal representation of genders across organizations. Genwa is focused on strategizing and developing and retaining diverse talent in her current role. And she's belonging while building capital and transforming organizations into talent factories. So I'm going to pass it over to Genwa to say a few words about herself too.
Thanks a lot, Lakshmi. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I just want to say it's a privilege for me to be in this event, participating in this event, and I'm looking forward to collaborate with my other fellow panelists as well. To be honest, I think you have summarized holistically what I do. However, I just want to shed the light that diversity, equity, and inclusion for me continues to be a top priority, not because I operate in a corporate world, but also because as a woman, I've witnessed and experienced so many stories, let me put them this way, that actually forbidden me to be wherever I wanted to be in this world. But however, the power in me and the power in the people around me whom I've managed to network and build trust was key for my success. And that's why I'm here to share what could corporates today and what could you as a human operating in this world or corporate world can do and have to do, or where possible you can do in order for you to be a more relaxed human operating and living the corporate or the corporate world. So equity, diversity, and inclusion continues to be a primary goal, I think, not only for me, for us, but for the world today. It's time to be really aware of it, and it's time to really act on it. So thank you so much for the introduction, Lakshmi.
Thanks, Genwan. I'm sure all of you heard our four panelists today introduce themselves, and that itself kind of explains how diverse this forum is, and each one has their own experiences and struggles that they've overcome here, and they're here today with us. So my first question would be to Christina to talk about and give some instances where what do you feel, Christina, have been some of the biggest mistakes that organizations make when they think about diversity itself? What are your experiences around how you resolve that, or what are your viewpoints on that?
Well, I think that many times when it comes to diversity, people will do some very quick, I'm talking about from like an organizational level. I think that there might be some quick remedies or performances or shows that people put on. I'm not writing them off completely, but I think that as an example, International Women's Day celebrations, Pink Friday, Pride Month, and so forth. I think that sometimes, that there's a place for them, no doubt, but I think that it isn't just about acknowledging the day or the month. I think that it really like making sure that all of these things kind of continue on throughout the year. And I'm not saying that this is an easy task for organizations, no doubt, but I think that when we're thinking about creating a cultural shift or awareness of any sort, it's not just something that it's HR's duty to do. I think it needs to come from different layers of management. And that comes from C-suite, that comes from senior leaders, that comes from emerging leaders as well. So I think more collaborative conversations need to happen in order for actions and for movement to change. So I guess to sort of recap, I would say that it's not just resting with HR. People very often have a love-hate relationship with HR. And so I think that it really kind of delegating it in that direction is not helpful. It needs to be a communal sort of effort. And I will say that, of course, it's important to have these days of acknowledgement, just like, for example, Mother's Day or Father's Day. But I think that, in general, the sentiment or the idea behind even those holidays is that, you also love and support and appreciate your parents each day, or at least in theory, that's how it's supposed to go. So I think that creating a cultural shift, through different layers of management, working collaboratively with HR. And also I want to add on bringing in the learning and development and talent team, because I think that very often it isn't just about the, I don't want to be rude by putting, being gimmicky about it, say, for example, everybody wearing the pink t-shirts or having the rainbow cupcakes and so forth. That can be nice. But I think that what is it that people really need? Do they need a training on something to understand legalese? Do they need to have coaching sessions or mentoring come into the workplace? Do they need to establish a framework for allyship? And how to even approach allies in the office. So I think that those are some of the things that I have seen in my experience, and on my wish list, I wish things in those areas would be a little bit different.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you mentioned about, bringing in your learning and development team and creating, having coaching sessions. So I'd like to ask Genwa, because I know she did bring this up. How do you build a coaching culture to help, emphasize and focus on DEI as an agenda in your organization, Genwa?
Sure. So let me start by saying this is not an easy job, especially that this is a topic that majority of the people or plenty of the people around the world don't feel comfortable talking about it. And especially when you say, you know, here is an allyship program, you know, try to join, to understand what does an ally mean. And at some point, people will freak out, right? So embedding that coaching culture in the business is important for them to understand why are we doing this, the importance of doing it, showing them the results. So if I have to give you actual examples of what have we done, at least from an operational side, on a business level, I can tell you that we've done awareness sessions, we've done trainings on how to, situational based trainings, right? So we've looked into the nitty-gritty situations that we had in the business. We put them in a business case concept. We allowed them to live the experience, feel it. In a way or another, we had to put them under pressure as well to make them understand what is it and how does it feel like to be in that specific position, right? So you measure the stress, you measure the feelings, you observe the feelings, and so on. So doing that, right, takes time, and doing it right is important in the first place. And I'm telling you, it's not, a button that you can press, but rather, a journey that you have to embark on. And most importantly, you can start with inviting everyone and normalizing, so we can normalize it in the end and people can adopt it, right? So speak about it in a way that it is not in a defensive mode, but the benefits out of it. Why is it important? Again, today we are working, in different countries, but we don't just serve one country. We're serving the world, right? And serving the world means different time zones, different cultures, different mindsets, different ethnical backgrounds, different beliefs. So it is okay for you not to be aware of how others think or about their belief system, but it's not okay for you to be ignorant about it and pretend that you don't want to know, right? Try to learn, try to understand how can you operate, how can you actually communicate, because it's important for you as an individual, for your own personal growth. If you really want to have a global mindset, if you really want to grow in your life, if you really want to expand your horizon, and if you really want to achieve the success that you're looking for as a human at the beginning and as a professional, it's important for you to understand, the power of diversity and the power of being inclusive. And that's how we transform our culture into a more coaching culture or adopt a coaching culture mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful statement in itself, that we've got to adapt and understand the importance of and accept it. I see that we have a question in the chat box, but I think first I'd just like to ask Rashida. She said she earlier did mention in her introduction that she's passionate about intersectionality in DEI. I'd like to request her to share a bit more, maybe also answer the question that we have in the chat box, which says, what is currently being done to ensure that people of all racial backgrounds have an equal chance of being hired? What accountability systems are currently in place, especially in Singapore? So if there's anything that you have experienced in your career, that would be useful for us to hear today.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I think I'll address the point first around intersectionality before I address the question, which is a good question, by the way. So just kind of going back to intersectionality, and I actually noticed that there's someone representing Catalyst in the attendees, so that's great. But again, kind of quoting Catalyst, right, as the nonprofit think tank in this area. So intersectionality is a framework for understanding how social identities, such as gender, race, ethnicity, social class, religion, sexual orientation, ability, and gender identity overlap with one another, and with systems of power that oppress and advantage people in the workplace and broader communities. So that, I think, sets the context for intersectionality, right? And I think to your question, the very first question that you asked to Christina earlier, I think that's a good question. Now, one of the ways in which organizations have started thinking about diversity, and of course, we've made progress over time, but we always need to tweak and improve what we are doing, right, to the environment that we're in, is I think it's so much easier to address issues of discrimination or prejudice for aspects of identity which are seen, right, which are visible to others. And you know, gender could be one example of it. Your skin color, ethnicity could be another example of it. But there are other aspects of your identities which are not seen. And what do I mean by this? So we talk about neurodivergent individuals, right? People who are on the spectrum, for example. We talk about, you know, if you do identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus, community, for example. I identify myself as a cisgender woman. But when you do have programs in the organization, for example, a woman ERG, right? So kind of like broad stroke. Okay, we're going to have a program targeting women in the organization. We are going to have quota system to address gender balance and gender balance in the leadership ranks or in the workforce. That's great, but then over time we need to realize: are we just are these programs just advantaging one type of women in the organization, and are we further marginalizing other types, right? So, for example, like someone who identifies themselves as a trans woman, are they being further marginalized through programs that is put in place in the organization? If they if they are on the spectrum, how else is the organization further enabling them, right? And then I was also reading a book by an author called Pragya Agrawal on motherhood, otherhood, right? There's maternal bias as well. These things come into play. So I think it is important for us to take that one step further when we talk about DEI, to also understand the nuances in the programs that organizations also put in place. And the other aspect I do want to address, and this is also very important to me, is as I walk the ground in with some of the grassroots communities and organizations that I support, is I think it is safe to say as well, across the board, that corporates, with knowledge workers or white collar workers, essentially, right? We have a lot of these programs, but for industries, for organizations or industries that operate, kind of more for the labor workforce, the workers, DEI is not a mature concept as it is for organizations like for that most of us actually operate in. I was recently part of another panel discussion a couple of weeks ago, and I was kind of speaking to someone who works as a firefighter, a female firefighter, and she wears the hijab, and she was kind of talking about naturally some of the things that she faced in the workplace, which she says, obviously it is a very strange career choice for her, but she made that choice, and it is a noble job, right? She is trying to save lives essentially by being a female firefighter. You hardly hear of that, but I thought that was a very interesting anecdote. But obviously the infrastructure at her workplace does not support her, right? So she talks about, for example, simple things like the washroom, right? She doesn't have enough cubicles, for example, to go to. So there are all these things that we need to start thinking about, the little nuances in our environment and world today. So that's one. I think just to address the question earlier about ensuring that people of all racial backgrounds have equal chance of being hired. It is I would say firstly, it is, as with everything, it is always a mindset shift, right? It starts with the culture, it starts with the mindset. One of the, there are, I think it is important for us to also establish that there are pros and cons to every system, right? That, there's no perfect model in this world. But for me personally, I think eliminating, simple things like eliminating ways for you to codify the ethnicity or the background, racial background of a particular person. I think that could be one example, because when it comes to hiring, and I'm not from HR, but I used to be a hiring manager before, what you want to do is ensure that you're hiring based on a person's merits and really their capabilities and what they can bring to the table, without looking at every other, things, right? Obviously, when you go through the interview process, human bias comes into play. But I think to firstly enable someone to even get a chance through the door, through their CV, you should eliminate any forms of codifying the person's, kind of racial or ethnic identities. Now, I understand that some organizations and institutions do put this in place, but I think the right thing to do is also ensure that it is not a mandatory, it's not mandatory for them to answer this question. And I think I've come across organizations that, basically have made this an optional declaration on the part of the candidate. But in some other instances, they still make it a mandatory field for candidates or, anyone applying for a certain role or a certain opportunity to declare. But I think it is quite a big, broad problem, right? I would say. But that's one aspect of addressing that. And in terms of, the question around accountability systems, of course, it is ensuring, from time to time, data is always important. Just ensuring that we are looking at the data and seeing, how, hiring across the board and whether I'm not a fan of the quota system, by the way. But from time to time, we do need to look at statistics and data to see whether or not there are any communities that are left behind and how we can further, enable them. Because that brings us to the point of equitability, right? So we talk about DE&I, but there's also the piece around equitability, because sometimes, we need to address why are certain communities left behind. Is it because we are not giving them equitable access to, for example, education, and also opportunities within the workforce? I'll kind of stop there and let other panelists chime in as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I totally agree with you. Being from a recruitment background, I think data, while data can't make you make all your decisions, but it actually helps you make informative decisions to make any subtle changes. And like we've earlier heard our colleagues talk about, that subconscious bias, and really look at how we want to shape the organization if you want it to be equitable. So I'm going to move on to Ruchira, and I really like her thoughts on this. She says to me that we often hear about D&I, we hear about DEI, we hear about DEIJ, we hear about DEIBJ being used, interchangeably. There's so many forms of this word that's there, but Ruchira actually refers it to as EID. So I would like to call her out and ask her to explain what those letters mean to her, and why does D&I actually matter. And I think the audience has a question for you, Ruchira. So I'll just read it out. You could probably also address that question. I think Lilia has asked us, historically, the banking industry is known for the lowest female representation in the senior management positions. Can you give your experience in the banking space, and if you can share any effective actions that have moved the dial towards equity and diversity? So over to you, Ruchira.
Question, and we'll come to that. So I'll just start with the first question, Lakshmi, which is this new alphabet that we all are expected to learn now: DEI, D. Where does it all fit in, and how does it work? And and this is my perspective, and happy to hear what others have to say. But diversity is simply a statistic, right? Diversity is about the variety around us. It's about what the 8 billion people around us represent really. It's a representation of our world. And diversity is about the kind of differences that people hold in their lives. Be it gender, be it the way they think, the way they act. Which country do they belong to, which race do they belong to. So all of these aspects, that make us unique are actually what diversity is about. And it's being, like they say, invited to the dance. And when we activate diversity, we try and get that representation going in our organizations, in our workplaces. The E of it, the equity of it is really about, opportunities really that are right for the context that an individual is coming from, as different from equality, which is the same thing for everyone. And my favorite example, and this was, a little cartoon that I saw the other day, was, if there are 3 people trying to peep over a fence, and the 3 of them are of different height, will you give them the same size stools, or will you give the shortest person a tall stool and, make sure that they're able to see it? So equity is all about, giving it based on the need. I heard another example on this one recently, which, just really hit home on how equity is about flexible policies, really. A very interesting way to put it, where the example was that, these days when you're on a flight, and thank God that COVID's over and we are all able to travel again, but when you're on a flight and, you go in and you're told that, hey, the airline staff is not going to help you haul your bag up into the overhead compartments. And that's all good till you have someone who's short, who doesn't have the height to reach that place. Or you have someone whose, arms are filled because they have a little baby to carry or things like that. And then the steward will step in and help you put it up. And that's equity. You're not having a blanket rule that nobody's going to be helped, and that's equal. You have equity wherein you are helping based on the needs of the people. So that, I think, to me, is a good example. Inclusion is actually a behavior, right? Very different from diversity. It's how we behave to make people feel welcome and accepted. And I saw a beautiful example of this right now on our call when, Genwa joined in, and she was the only one who said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you're from. That is inclusion. That's making you feel welcome wherever in the world you're joining in from. And that was beautiful. And I was like, hey, why didn't I think of that? But that is inclusion. It's about, how we make people feel welcome. And to quote the cliche, if, diversity is about asking people to the dance, inclusion is about helping them dance and playing their music and, getting them to do all of that. Oh, yes. And then you were talking about belonging, right? Belonging is actually the feeling that people have when they are included. So, what do I do to make them feel included? What does a woman who needs to come to make sure that there's enough milk available for her child feel when there is a maternity room in the workplace versus she's saying, let me just go to the toilet for an extra 15 minutes and stand inside that cubicle and do something? The difference in the feeling, when do I feel I belong? When my difference is taken into account and there is work done to make me feel welcome. That is the feeling of belonging. I feel I belong to this place. I'm valued and I'm respected and I'm human. I don't have to dehumanize myself by following, what everyone does, what majority does. It allows me to be human, and that's a good feeling of belonging. Justice, really, the J, is the outcome, right? What are we really doing all of this for? We are doing all of this for because we want it to be a fair world. We want a world where people are not disadvantaged because of where they were born. They're not disadvantaged because of the choices they're making about their life. They're not disadvantaged because they feel a certain way sexually. They're not disadvantaged because they have a certain passport. They're not disadvantaged because of their gender. So justice is about making sure people are not disadvantaged because of things that are beyond their control. The kind of things that we just spoke about. So that really is justice. It gives people access to the same sort of opportunity. And it's the goal of all DE&I activation. And my daughter was telling me today that they call it JEDI now, J-E-D-I. So it'll keep evolving. Yeah. And we'll just have to keep pace and make sure that we're on the ball and we learn all this new alphabet, because it's not going away. The world's changing, and we've got to make sure that we do the things that are needed to make it, a better world. Going to the question that you raised, Lilian, thank you for that. You spoke about, and I'm just trying to go back to the question, that given my experience in banking, any effective actions to move the dial, given that traditionally we have had, a very, very low female representation in the senior level. I think, the starting point really is awareness. So where are you on your metrics is how it starts, perhaps, and the right metrics. So as an example, in the bank that I worked, we did some kind of number crunching, and we realized that in our department, it was nice and happy, 48% almost. I'm just fixating the number. It was something similar, but that percentage, and that sounded very good, right? That number is good. But when we segregated it and looked at the senior levels and the junior levels, we realized that all the secretaries were women, all the junior staff were women. And when we moved up, this number just kept going down. There seemed to be a kink in the pipeline. And that awareness itself prompted certain actions. So I think the first starting point is awareness, both in terms of organization stats and as individuals ourselves. Most of the organizations that I've seen are on a certain maturity curve when it comes to DE&I work. And where they are, every input is important. So your training about awareness is important. All of that is very important. So the awareness generation training is the starting point, really. I remember all of us were put through this, 2-hour-long training as individuals to understand what our biases really are. What are the biases that hold us back from being inclusive? And I realized that I had some biases. and without fear of judgment, you know, in a way that I'll just hold back and say, hey, I don't have any biases, I'm holier than thou, and I'll never change then. We were encouraged to acknowledge these biases and say, very important, know that they exist, and now don't act on them. Make sure that you don't carry them into your workplace and think a certain way about someone just because you have a stereotype or a bias in your head. Get over that. So I think the awareness trainings that I've seen in the banking sector are actually excellent. Some of the metrics they work with are actually excellent. There's action taken to actually work on the pipeline. So I've seen mentoring programs for the middle level hyper women and other women, which actually then encourage you to be yourself and bring your best to work. You know, there's this wonderful PIE model that the mentoring program talks about, you know, performance, image, and exposure. Your performance is really table stakes in today's world if you want to succeed, if you want to grow in the organization. Exposure is actually 60% of your success factor. And what is exposure? Do people know what you do? Do people know what achievements you have? They don't, because you hesitate. You think selling yourself is bad. You don't want to brag, right? I attended, you know, a training recently. It's called I Am Remarkable. It's a free training by Google. And the first thing they tell you is it's not bragging if it's based on fact. Go ahead and say it. You've done all the good stuff. Go ahead and say it. And I think exposing people to such kind of mentoring programs can be fantastic. So mentoring was again something that I saw. Reverse mentoring, you know, your leadership, if they're in the game, they're open to feedback. They're open to hearing what the underrepresented are really struggling with. And senior leadership in our organization actually got into reverse mentoring. They spoke to very young people from different countries and cultures, things that they didn't know about. Because sadly, people making a lot of these D&I policies are not even affected by them. So it's very important to get the right feedback in. And that's what I saw in my place of work. And that was brilliant. And I just want to add to what Christina said about, you know, the whole coaching culture. This whole mindset change that's going to help us move forward requires awareness, requires challenging beliefs, requires changing behavior. It's the heart of what coaching does. So if you work with a good coach, this is where it'll really add value to your life. You know, it'll help you open up, it'll help you with all these things. And I think the one very big thing that coaching does is it helps you forgive yourself and be kind to yourself. And when you are empathic to your own self, you overall build that empathy muscle and you can practice it with others, which is a good starting point to being inclusive. So I think, Lilia, to your question, I think, you know, these four things, getting the metrics right so that you know what you're tracking, mentoring, lot of awareness generation exercises, barefoot coaching, as I call it. Just take it all across your organization and it'll help. So yeah, that's my perspective.
Thanks a real lot, Ruchi. That was very insightful. So I see a lot of common themes between the four of you. We talked about coaching, we talked about mentoring, reverse mentoring, and the examples that all of you gave were really, really strong examples. So I think these are good topics that we've discussed. And I on the same note, I'd like to go back to and ask Genwa, like we've heard that, you know, people need to get coached. Okay, they need to focus on being self-aware, but what are some of the actions that they do that each one of us can actually take in our day-to-day lives and do our bit for D&I? And Genwa, would you like to add on to that, please?
Okay, so I think if I got this right from you, Lakshmi, it's basically doing self-reflections, right? And how do we invite others to do these kinds of self-reflections? To be honest, there is multiple ways, and people usually prefer or pick their own preferred style of doing it. There is like no certain criteria or formula to do it. It is based on the individual's interest, but what we do usually do in here is to really advocate, you know, the power of having that global mindset as a human being. The power that you will feel when you are thinking globally, right? I mean, I come from a very, I'm Lebanese, so I'm born and raised there. I've always thought Lebanese, and I thought of Lebanon as being the one and only country in this world up until I have relocated to a country that is expat based. And this is when I really, got shocked by the different thinking and the different ways of living and the different approaches that are available across the world. And I think I'm lucky, to be honest. And I think, if I was previously educated about the differences across the world, I don't think I would have actually got surprised or shocked or got slapped on the face, right, from the different kind of people that I have engaged and worked and communicated with. So I think it all starts, back to your home. And the way, you're being raised, and the way that, the stories that you read, the books that you read, the movies that you watch, the people that you speak to until you hit, university. I think DE&I is not a topic that should be spoken about just in the workplace. It is a topic that should be embedded in every home, starting from, your parents, starting from your root, right? It has to be deeply rooted, because I don't think, I wasn't, I didn't grow up in an environment where I knew that, how DE&I is important and what can it do to me. I just learned it recently, to be honest, right? And every project comes in, I sign up for it, because I think I always think that I'm clueless, or, I don't have the enough knowledge or the information. So again, it's my curiosity. Again, it's my will to understand and my will to help. And I think every person in the world, if they have the will to change, they will adopt a DE&I mindset. So it's not, I don't invite you, I encourage you, right? That's what I say in the business. But if I invite you and I encourage you, it's for ABC and purposes, and it's up to you if you want to take it on your shoulders, or if you want to really feel accountable or an advocate for it. So yes, it starts from the home. That's in my own personal opinion. Thank you.
I absolutely love what you just said there, Genwa, and I totally agree with you. It starts from your home. It starts from you thinking about it right there, and then how you perform in your day-to-day lives, where you just are, think about diversity and equality. And I'm sure a lot of us also are coming from backgrounds where we wouldn't have realized it until we actually come to a workforce. I think I relate to that, being, as more conscious of, and I didn't know that there were these options or choices that you could actually make as an individual. So I totally agree with you. Thanks for sharing. That's very personable and relatable. I'd like to just go back to Christina. I know we could go on about this. I know I'm conscious, because there's a lot more questions I have on my mind. I'm sure the audience wants to hear a lot more, but we have a couple of minutes. Earlier, Christina talked about, the mistakes that organizations make while, trying to make it more diverse and inclusive. And she also brought up the topic of allyship. But I think while they do that, there's always this sense of psychological safety, right, Christina? What's the importance of people actually feeling psychologically safe in an environment, and the conversations that they can have to actually talk about it? What are your views on this, Christina?
Thanks for that. I think that psychological safety comes in a few different layers. I think it's kind of a bit of a spectrum of such. There's the inclusive bit, and then once people, as a starting point, feel that they are included initially, then, they start to open up a little bit more. And you might all see this in your own environments, how once people kind of settle in, it's kind of like breaking in a new pair of shoes, right? And then I think once people start learning in a work environment, then that gives them the confidence to become, contributive and collaborative in that sense. And then eventually gaining the confidence, depending on the situation, and over time, eventually, to challenge the status quo. So I think that, when it comes to, our topic for today, psychological safety, is really essential in order for conversations to flow, whether it's feedback or whether it's someone, you know, having the courage to be able to vocalize things in the office, you know, and call out, you know, issues and behaviors that might have been the status quo, but need in fact to change. And so I think that psychological safety is, you know, a company or an organization that is encouraging those spaces for people to open up. And going back to the point about allyship, it's just, you know, when we talk about something that I don't think that has come up in this conversation tonight in our spaces, staff retention. More and more, these kinds of situations are coming up where if people are not feeling included, you know, they're going elsewhere for work. And not included, you know, can feel that way for women, for people of the LGBTQ space, can feel that way for people who get older, like me.
Yeah.
You know, a few years ago, people are like, oh, you don't know what Slack is? Oh, whatever. That's a minor thing, but it can also leave, you know, amongst other things, can leave, you know, people feeling excluded. And, you know, if that builds up over time, you know, people might want to look elsewhere for work. So in essence, I think that when there is that psychological safety, it really can, it's like the gel of the office. And again, that doesn't mean that it happens or is established overnight, but it is something that, you know, in terms of, it's not just HR's responsibility, but it's people, you know, within management, it's within the talent team, if there needs to be a training or coaching on that. It's just something that is such an important, not just ingredient, I would call it almost a nutrient to have in the workplace in order for it to be a comfortable environment for people to bring out the very best in themselves and contribute to the organization's success.
Thanks for that, Christina. So I'm just gonna ask each one of you to give us one takeaway before we end the session. I know I still have a lot of questions, or unless the audience has any other question for any of our panelists before our time is over. Or else I will just, Christina, what's your takeaway for our audience today?
I think it's important for people to be able to share their stories. We talk about diversity, inclusion and belonging and justice. Rosita touched upon that, that theme of intersectionality. We all have something deep within us. We shouldn't be judging a book by its cover. And I think getting curious and exploring that more is something that really brings diversity and inclusion alive.
Yeah, Rosita, can you give us your key takeaway for today and for our audience, please?
Sure. I would say that adding on to what Christina said, right? The one thing that I did not mention is, as we progress in this space, and I think it is amazing for me personally, you know, having, you know, been in the workforce for more than 10 years, and obviously, you know, kind of a cumulative experience in the world as well. We've come a long way, right? Over the years, we, as a society, we become more enlightened and we learn more about, you know, differences in the world. We become more global. We see how people are different. You know, people become more diverse themselves. Like for me, I am married to someone outside of my, you know, culture. We are raising children in a multiracial, multicultural family. It's amazing to see the progress that we've made as a society, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes when we take one step forward, society can take 2 steps backwards, as we've seen with what's happening in some parts of the world today. So we need to be always mindful of that. And for those of us who are championing this cause, we need to just keep going. And despite, you know, all these forces that sometimes pull us backwards, we need to constantly motivate each other and always, you know, kind of, you know, fight the cause and identify ways to rally the support from like-minded individuals to understand the importance of why, you know, a diverse, equitable and inclusive society is important as we move forward as in the world today.
Thank you for that. Ruchira, could you give us a few words before we end our session, please?
Thank you. One thing that I want to leave our audience with today is be kind and be curious. Those are actually the first steps you can take to be inclusive in your life. when we are kind and we are curious. So go ahead, meet different people, have a cup of coffee with somebody you've never spoken to before, smile at, more people, do all of that, be kind and stay curious. And I think that's going to make this world a little more inclusive than it is today.
Thanks for that, Ruchira. And Genwa?
Okay, sorry, I was struggling with putting myself off mute. See, to me, diversity is just the start. It's the first milestone, and equity happens to be the second, followed by the most and main important, which is inclusion, right? And all these, according to me and my understanding and how my own belief, will lead to, a culture of belonging, right? So the magic in here basically is, if I have to say it, it's the fabric of belonging. What we have spoken about today basically are multiple elements. These are enablers. So if we weave in those enablers, we will probably produce a texture for inclusivity, which leads basically to that, what we call in our corporate world, the fabric of belonging, right? If people have that feeling, it means they have the psychological safety in place. It's free for them to speak. It's free for them to be their authentic selves. If we have these structures in terms of training programs, coaching, mentoring, buddy systems, if all these structures are available, then this is another way to enhance the DE&I aspect in the business, right? So there are multiple elements that contribute. And if I have to sum up my own thinking into this, right? Aside from being curious, as Ruchira has added, I think this whole system should be governed by empathy and care, right? If there is no empathy and care, what are we expecting in here? And the question would be, where are we going to go forward without these two elements? So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks to all our speakers. So I think some of the common themes that we heard from all of them was allyship, coaching, mentoring, to be more aware, and for each of us to do our bits every day, right at our home, and start from there and make it a more diverse and inclusive environment. If you have any questions, I think earlier on, you did see all our speakers' IDs, and you can contact them for any further questions, or you can take some time out for them to hear more of their views. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I want everyone to stay on because we are going to do a group picture. But before we do that, I, of course, want to thank each one of you for being here today. Lakshmi, you did a fabulous job of moderating this session. And thank you, Rasida. Thank you, Ruchira, Christina, and Genwa for all your valuable input. And one thing I wanted to tell the audiences is that when we were curating this particular topic and we had invited our speakers, our panelists, we actually didn't realize how diverse the group is. And I guess this is the beauty about the topic, that it affects each one of us, regardless of our gender, our faith, ethnicity, cultural background, even geographic location. And yes, and thank you everybody who's in attendance today for this. We saw some great questions and comments coming in, and like Lakshmi said, please do feel free to connect with everyone who's here today. Their details are on the chat group. And of course, if you wanted to know more about the personal journeys of Lakshmi, Rasida, and Genwa, do grab a copy of the book Shaken, Stirred, but Not Deterred, and Christina's book, My Voice, Volume 3, both of which have been Amazon #1 bestsellers. Details are on the chat group. And with that, let's do a group picture. Let's do one with this too.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much, everyone.